Such excellent remarks from Dr. Vera Shongwe on economic strategies and how disruption can indeed propel and enable us to innovate beyond borders. My name is Vuyolwethu Dubese, an innovation consultant and entrepreneur, and I'm pleased to be driving this next conversation with top women in global markets and private equity as we navigate strategies to accessing funding and capital for your business. In the next 45 minutes, we will highlight the current conditions of accessing funding and capital for your SMEs and startups, as well as the implication that the global health pandemic has had on private equity and impact investment commitments for African markets. This conversation is led by top women in global markets and private equity who are part of the top 5% of women in Africa in charge of managing funds. And I think that we can all agree that the pipeline needs to grow through intentional, broad-based transformation. And we'll also have the opportunity to consult the work that the Standard Bank Group is doing in partnership with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa with the African Women Impact Fund. Our final key point of discussion is accelerating the conversation in the gear of re-engineering and reprogramming funding and capital for SMEs and startups that are found and led by women. This will highlight the strategies and the reset that will definitely need to take place in building a more robust agenda to meet the shocks of the future and cushion the growth and scale of businesses that needs to take place, including the likes of startup regulatory frameworks. As we begin to weigh in on this panel discussion, we also invite the thousands of top women who are tuned into this conversation to engage with us in the comments section and ready your questions for our Q&A segment. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me the honor to introduce our panelists for this session, themed strategies on how to access funding and capital. I have with me Lindeka Dzedze, the Global Markets Executive Head for Institutional Clients at Standard Bank. I'm also joined by Simone Cooper, the Head of Business Banking at Standard Bank. And rounding off our trio of excellent panelists is Natalie Colby, the Global Head of Private Equity at Actis. Ladies, thank you for joining us and welcome to what I hope will be a strong conversation that will churn insights and opportunities to our thousands of top women tuned in. I'll kickstart this conversation consulting the macroeconomic outlook that was projected by the African Development Bank, forecasting a growth of 3.9% in 2020 at the beginning of the year. And with the global pandemic hitting the continent and the world, this was revised to negative 3.4% in July. And offering quite an alternative and a sobering perspective to this was the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, lending to us the intelligence that African private equity is more attractive than developed markets, of course, looking at a 5 to 10 year horizon. With all these data points in front of us, it's clear that the conversation of funding and capital is worth taking a longer term view when considering Africa. And in your opening remarks, I invite you and your thoughts on the current global health pandemic and its implications, respectively, in your stakeholder engagements and in the institutions that you represent, and how it has either encouraged your engagement and operations to take a step back or recommit even harder to investing in businesses across the continent. Natalie, I'll start with you and then invite Simone and Lindeka to open up our discussion.
Thanks, Vuyo, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to comment on this. I mean, look, I think there's no doubt that the COVID pandemic and the government's response to that has put a dent in growth in Africa. I mean, certainly the pandemic has left the continent poorer and the citizens with less disposable income. But I think therein lies the opportunity. And I think the gauntlet has been laid down for all of us to find innovative ways in which we can bring products and services that the population needs at a price point that they can afford. And I think really the way in which we can do this is to look at innovative ways in which we can bring the product to market, and specifically using technology. And I think just, using a very simple example of education, where currently, the public sector education on the continent is generally poor and overstretched. The private sector education is generally unaffordable. And think about an online platform where you're able to bring the best professors right into the sitting rooms of students on the African continent, and giving them a high quality education opportunity, but at a fraction of the cost. And that's just one example of millions of types of innovative ideas where we can leapfrog the continent into a different place, and therein provide investable opportunities for the likes of private equity and VC.
Excellent. Simone?
Thanks, Vuyo, and thanks so much for the opportunity. I think from my perspective, what has struck me about the pandemic has been the human element that I think has come through in all of the engagements that we have. So obviously the portfolio that I look after is lending to small businesses and a lot of women businesses in that. And I think that previously banks have almost been a bit faceless, and they haven't understood the true impact that they have in assisting businesses and small businesses to grow, and the communities in which those businesses operate to develop. So I certainly think that from a banking sector perspective, there's almost been this reset in which banks are going, I actually now truly understand the impact that we do have from an economic perspective, from a growth perspective, and from a support perspective, and the role that we play within communities. And so I believe that this will actually be a positive for the communities in which we operate, because people are now truly starting to understand what the role that banks can play within society. I also think that a lot of banking execs and people within the banking sector are re-looking and doing a lot of introspection during this time. So I certainly know from a Standard Bank perspective, one of the things that we are looking at is our purpose is Africa is our home and we drive her growth. We've obviously done a lot in the communities that we operate in, but we certainly are challenging ourselves and saying, have we actually done enough? What more can we do? And I think that that is positive for businesses and for growth going into the future.
Excellent. Lindeka?
Thank you, Vuyo, and thank you to the audience and for giving us this opportunity. I think published numbers have shown that it is women who bear the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic at both a personal and a professional level. I think conversations like these highlight the need for innovative and deliberate solutions to accelerate growth and support. And I think we can never underestimate the role of financial institutions like ours to actually drive and come up with new solutions. I'm quite aware that this audience is made up of investors and women entrepreneurs and key decision makers. And for me, what is important is that we use data to make decisions, and numbers are important. I think Simone has touched on the small and medium and possibly also on the informal side of the business. We know that small and medium enterprises are the biggest drivers of employment in the sub-Saharan continent. We also know that in terms of percentages, the African continent has the most is leading in terms of women entrepreneurs. So what we do in terms of this space for me is important. And one of the things you touched on, which I will come on in terms of when we start talking about what solutions we're looking at, is when you speak about private equity, and also in terms of when you talk about venture capital. Of interest, actually, fun enough, is that only 2% of female-founded businesses receive venture capital funding. And only 7% of private equity capital on the continent goes to invest in women-owned businesses. So for me, working for Standard Bank has been a privilege, and I'm grateful that the gender agenda is actually on the forefront of that. And it allows us as a business and institution to actually come up with solutions to drive this. As Simone alluded to, our mission and our purpose, it is, Africa is our home and we drive her growth. They call it Africa, we call it home. So I think we have different perspective, and I think we should be coming up with different solutions to this problem. Because as you look at the growth numbers that are forecasted now and where we are, I think the women in business are possibly falling far and far behind. And it is now the opportunity for us to actually take the advantage of what's happening and that's playing out in front of us to come up with solutions and do a bit more in this space. And I know from a banking perspective, this is a big strategy.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we have the capital of this conversation to inform us of what financial institutions across the continent are doing to drive these decisions, and how the data, the wealth of data that is out there is helping us really create these solutions that are inclusive to create this, we talk about this financial future being female. I want to circle back to Simone on traditional financing. We're going to get into private equity and VC in just a moment, but traditional financing in the funding of SMEs and startups takes place in many forms, of course, and one of the oldest forms and prominent forms of business finance is business financing has been through banking. In such a time where business continuity is dependent on capital and funding, what conversations are entrepreneurs to be having with their business bankers, and the strategic lens that they should be approaching and looking through when talking about financing their businesses for the future, and much more presently as well for this pandemic to survive?
So I think where it's twofold. The first is the tactical piece that you referred to in terms of how does a business actually just make it through this environment? And I think that is very difficult for a lot of small businesses. Natalie touched on the response from a government perspective, and particularly in a country like South Africa, there's been a huge lockdown, which has massively impacted a lot of businesses. There's also been lockdowns in other countries like Uganda, Kenya, for example. And so small business in itself has been impacted hugely. I think the first piece is that businesses must be honest with their bankers, and they must tell it as it is and say, this is the situation that I'm faced with, and these are the problems that I've got from my side. The other component to that is that the business owner must make sure that they're on top of their numbers. So have a good handle on cash flows, have a good handle on what their financial projections are. And even though that is probably very difficult in this time, it's important to have that information to hand. And then I think that business owners need to also have a hard look at themselves and their business and say, what is it that they can do to get themselves through this? So absolutely, banks and your traditional financiers need to come to the party and support businesses through this time. But the business owners themselves also need to say, what is it that I can do either to cut costs or to pivot my business and take advantage of some opportunities that may be presenting themselves to get through this period. And I think that type of honest, open conversation with your bank is important, and is what will drive people getting through and SMEs surviving through this environment. I think there's also some upside in terms of what the pandemic presents. So looking more longer term, more strategically, I think that the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of human element that it's bringing about is that people really want to support local and want to support their community. And for small businesses, that is a massive advantage. So if you think about the restaurant up the road from you, or the local shop, everybody wants to be supportive of those types of businesses. And I think that small businesses have a huge opportunity to take advantage of that. And in addition to that, there's also massive change that is coming about. So the sectors that once were thriving may not necessarily be the ones that thrive during and after the pandemic. And small businesses are probably best placed to have a look at some of the opportunities that are emerging and think about what they can or can't do to change their business model and to take advantage of some of those. So I think that it represents a huge opportunity. It's all about introspection and reflection. And engaging with a lot of business owners over this period, a lot of them have said they've tried to view it as positive. So although it's been terrible from a revenue perspective, from a turnover perspective, and it's impacted them massively, a lot of them are trying to say, what is it that I've always wanted to do that I can now do and put those changes into my business or take advantage of an opportunity that I've always wanted to take advantage of.
Brilliant. And speaking of opportunities, Natalie, I want to stick to the means of said traditional financing and consult a report that recently came out with SAVCA, the Southern African Venture Capital Association, on the impact of venture capital and private equity in 2019. And the report informs us that only 16% of the surveyed startups favored private equity and venture capital for seed and early stage funding. And the top two reasons was looking at innovation acceleration, as well as the number of innovative ideas that can be churned out of the company. As you're writing and facilitating these checks, are you finding that these statistics complement what SAVCA has written about? And perhaps have the dynamics also changed with this disruption of the global pandemic? And what perhaps for the next 16% who would opt for venture capital, what is the strategy that these founders should be going into the boardroom with when opting for the VC and PE route when they're wanting to access finance?
Yeah, but look, I mean, I think it's important when founders are looking to bring private equity or VC into their life that they recognize that they are bringing a partner in, and it's a partner for quite some time. And I always say to anybody that we're working with and looking to invest in their businesses, this is a marriage and you should approach it as if it's a marriage. And that relationship is very important. And you need to make sure, as you would in a marriage, that you and your partner are on the same page and that you have the same vision for your future. And, you know, understanding what that private equity partner can bring or that VC partner can bring to you, what kind of skills can they bring, what access to markets, what networks, what technologies potentially, but also importantly to ask what they need from you, because it's not just a one-way bet, right? It's a symbiotic relationship, and
right.
And you know they're going to have their own demands and needs from you as an entrepreneur. So you are having a new master in your life, if I can call it that, but it is more of a relationship that you have to work together. And so I think finding the right partner is absolutely paramount. And what I would say to entrepreneurs is the person who's writing you the biggest check or giving you the highest valuation for your business is not necessarily the right partner. When private equity goes wrong, it doesn't go wrong because the business plan wasn't necessarily met. It goes wrong because the partnership fell apart and that you were no longer aligned. Mm-hmm. So I think being absolutely honest about what your goal is, what your end goal is, and where you want to be in 3 to 5 years' time, and importantly, upfronting the conversation about how you're going to get divorced, because you are going to get divorced. That's, VC and private equity is not permanent capital. Upfronting those conversations, and about your future and your vision, I think is super important, and it will certainly clear out a lot of problems along the way.
And I want to expand on that just a little bit, in that when you are opting for VC and private equity and PE, as opposed to a bank loan, what should you be going to a bank for, and what should you be going to a PE and a VC firm for, in terms of so as you're strategizing who I'm going to and particularly what for. Can you just expand your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're sitting as an entrepreneur, it's important to understand what kind of business you're in. I mean, are you in a lifestyle business? And think about a coffee shop or a spaza shop. A business that sustains your lifestyle and gives you some flexibility around that, but you're not looking to kind of take over the world. That kind of financing is more suitable to debts, to kind of working capital type facilities, which can come through microfinancing or ultimately banks as well. Those kind of businesses won't necessarily draw the attention of VC and private equity. And there's a reason for that. VC and private equity want growth, and they want to see a business that can scale. So if you're looking for scale, and you're looking for somebody to come and inject something in, whether it's capital or innovation, and you're wanting to grow the business and take it to the next level, that's when you should be bringing private equity and venture capital in, and asking them, how can they help you grow your business and take it to that next level. So I think it's important to understand what kind of entrepreneur you are, what kind of business you want, where you're wanting to take it, and then find the right partner depending on what it is that you're looking for.
Excellent. Lindeka, let's go behind the scenes a bit with the chilling statistics that you presented us with in terms of the recipients of funding on the continent. The fortune of funding and capital still favors traditional financing. However, this fortune doesn't extend its favor in the pipeline in the sector. There's currently 5% of women in Africa in charge of managing funds, and in response to this, the Standard Bank Group has partnered with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and several other partners to establish a platform to accelerate the growth of women-owned and operated investment funds and companies across Africa. I think this is an excellent opportunity to discuss the transformation that needs to happen in the sector due to the meritocracy that occurs. But with this 10-year plan and this raising of a $1 billion fund to address the problem, and perhaps take us through the stages of the phases of this incubation and the investment that the fund will address with the selected participants and the deployment of the funds.
Thank you, Vuyo, and thank you for that $1 billion number in 10 years. So I need everybody with us to make this happen. So I guess the genesis of the fund from our perspective is simply to increase the size of assets managed by women fund managers, and in turn increase the scale of economic decisions that they make. So we're looking to create a platform that will support the growth of fund managers, women fund managers, and surround them with the necessary technical and assistance to create a sustainable and sustainable platform. We've embarked on a 3-phased approach to address this from our side. And I must say we're doing this obviously utilizing the bank's asset management division. It is a fund of funds structure. We are doing it with our standard multi-manager business that has been doing this for a number of years. So the first approach that we're taking is that the African Women Impact Fund will invest in established women managers within the listed and private debt market space with a proven record as co-managers or lead managers. And then this for us is obviously as possibly naturally will come in here a far more find that it's an easier space for us to be able to deploy the capital. And then the next phase we are looking at is to extend the mandate to include managers in private equity, and thus enabling the fund to hold a combination of listed and private assets investment. And that is for us phase 2 approach. But obviously, everything is dependent on us making sure that we are able to raise the $100 to $150 million in terms of the first close. And then the third phase for us that is important, as you say, that if we're looking to build the pipeline, we have to look at extending our mandate to include the incubation phase of women-owned asset managers on the continent. And this is where we're looking at providing that technical skill, that mentoring that is needed to actually drive this. So this is all for us, I guess, that phased approach to make sure we are able to have some credible and results and be able to have early wins to demonstrate that this is a viable solution. It is obviously one of its kind, possibly a first in the market. So there's a lot of pressure to make sure that this succeeds. For us, and as you can imagine, as we move further and further, if you look at what we're hoping to achieve, not only in terms of the assets under management, it is actually to make sure that within those firms that are either women-owned or women-led, is that you actually encourage those businesses that they invest in to actually apply also the gender lens. And I can imagine that for Natalie and Simone and I don't think when we sit in most of our meetings, we are facing people of our own gender. And oftentimes it is our male colleagues. And I do not think that this is something, I think it is a blind spot. And sometimes one that when we talk about, even when we talk about the ESGs in terms of strategy, the social part that speaks to women is often not as, I guess, from my perspective, from what we see, as over-indexed as it should be. And especially when we find ourselves in this space in terms of the impact of the pandemic in our areas. And I'm just thinking in terms of the broader ecosystem, and when we look at where we all come from, we know that also 70% of business consumption decisions on the continent are made by women. Yet we do not necessarily feature when you look at the institutions that we run or the corporates that we look after. And I think that's the reason we also have this conference, right?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought up this term of gender lens investing. And I'm going to swing the pendulum back to you in that Kenyan Women Holdings, they describe gender lens investing as investing in workplace equity and decision-making, funding the development of products and services which are focused on women and girls, as well as increasing women's access to capital. Now, conscious and unconscious bias has an impact in capital raising, and a response we've seen to this is the rise in gender lens investment catalyst funds across the continent, as well as across the diaspora. The Gender Innovation Lab tells us that almost 60% of Africa's self-employment workforce are women. And although our conversation is speaking to those women and at best with those with registered businesses who have formalized their businesses, there still is that great gap and that great opportunity that the informal sector presents for both investees and investor. And when you're looking at this context, what strategies, if each of you ladies can share one or two of these ideas that women who operate in non-tech SMEs and small businesses can leverage when it comes to accessing funding and capital? Linda, I'll swing the pendulum back to you in that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Vuyo. I think from my perspective, and I'm going to speak from where I come from and where I guess I sit, which is looking after these NBFI clients across asset classes. And I think for us, we are looking at the fund management space, and we're looking to make sure we influence those decisions that are made at that level to actually go deep down and actually look at these businesses. I guess this will come through when you talk about what happens in the private equity space, because then at least you're making sure that you will see investments that grow through that. And I guess this is now looking at a different level, because we're looking at most of the conversation that are taking place, looking at the small, medium, and also informal in terms of where the investments go through at that micro level. And we want to make sure we come through at the top down approach. So from that perspective, I think we're looking to make sure that, as I said earlier, is that it is a gender lens that is actually applied by those that are making those investment decisions ultimately, that will actually make sure that we drive that. But what also I'm mindful of is, for me, we're working with the Lionesses of Africa. The Lionesses of Africa is, in fact, I know Gabelo is not part of this call. She's actually one of those people that has been working with them since we had a partnership with the bank. And they're looking at women entrepreneurs across. And this also does not speak into just well-established businesses. This also looks at even your startups and also incubation level. So it actually does look into that. And we're hoping by working with them, we'll be able to access all the way down to that level in terms of informal level, where we bring them up the channels to be able to access what we're doing at the fund level.
Brilliant. Simone, in your experience?
So yeah, I'll talk at it from a SME's perspective. I think that one of the things that I reflect on is being able to tell your business's story is so critically important. And the reason I reflect on that, I was a judge at one of our startup funding capital pieces a few weeks ago, and there were a number of SMEs or startup entrepreneurs who were pitching their business ideas. And the ones that were successful in pitching their ideas were those that could tell their story exactly and succinctly what their business does, what makes their business different. So why is their business going to succeed versus somebody else's? What are the numbers looking like? How they're going to make money? And then I think there was also the piece around there's a buy-in to the person. So being a bit vulnerable in the space, opening up a bit to the audience, I think that is also quite important. So storytelling and what your business is about is critical. And I think that often as women, we tend to take a step back and be very good at talking about the numbers and all the pieces that logically make sense, but not necessarily getting people to buy into us and to the business that we want to run. And actually, as women, I think that we are very good at actually doing that when we just open up a bit and try to be a little bit more of ourselves rather than trying to be and competing in a man's world.
I love it. Natalie, how do we encourage women who are not a part necessarily of the formal sector, but to definitely leverage all of these capabilities and resources of the strategies to funding and capital that we're engaging on? How do they pull into that from your expertise?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's capital gets attracted to growth, full stop. I mean, I think there's businesses, you've got to show that you've got a path to growth and a path to scale, and that your business is sustainable. And I think that the one piece of advice I often will say to entrepreneurs that are kind of sitting in your own canoe, you're all kind of rowing really hard to try and grow your business organically, is to have a look at collaborations and to collaborate. Because often when you collaborate with others, whether it's in your supply chain, whether it's in your your distribution, and even with your competitors, and I know that might sound crazy, but you might be sitting here and on the top of your pile, but think about how much bigger or better you could be if you combine with your biggest competitor. There you end up with a scale business, one that will attract capital, one that's growing, one that's taken market share, that's got other opportunities to grow. So I often encourage entrepreneurs to think beyond just their own business and think about where in their ecosystem can they collaborate with others and be stronger together, as opposed to be trying to kind of just paddle your canoe in your own in your own place. I think the other thing that people can also look at to catapult growth is look at technology. I mean, I think there's so many technological innovation out there. Whether it's in accessing new markets, whether it's finding new clients, social media, whether it's looking at different ways in which you can develop your products, really embracing technology as a way to catapult yourself as well. So I'd say, looking at collaborations within your ecosystem, and then how can you boost your growth through using different technologies that are out there.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this panel discussion, I'm encouraged by the potential of impact design and expansion of funding and capital for women-owned and led businesses, as well as the investment funds. And I wonder what message we can convey to the top women tuned in regarding the environment, the challenges, the opportunities that are present in the sector. And with that in mind, also taking into appreciation the various stakeholders who are a part of this discussion and a part of this ecosystem, including government and not just the private sector and civil society. What is the one thing that you say is working and another that you'd propose to be definitely taken under consideration and advisory to design this inclusive capital and global markets for women and their businesses to thrive? Simone, I'll start with you on this one.
Thanks, Vuyo. So I think from my perspective, the positive piece, and I'm not really going to talk about the design components, but the positive piece for me is that we're having these types of conversations and that women have a seat at the table. So that for me is a great step forward. And there are these types of funds which are aimed at growing small businesses and women-owned businesses. And I think that that's fantastic. The piece that I think we just need to be careful about is, and I'll use the example of in the corporate world, because I think that that's something that we can all relate to, is that what I think has happened from a corporate perspective is often corporates will sit there and put a couple of women in senior leadership positions and hope that the rest will take care of itself. And very often it doesn't. And you come back 2, 3, 4 years later, and the transformation that you wanted to happen hasn't happened. And so I would just challenge all of us to not sit back. As women, we're going to have to consistently figure out what it is that we need to do differently and how do we need to do this differently. And I'm talking on both sides of the coin, from the funding side as well as from the entrepreneur side. I think that we've all got to make a concerted effort to see how we can make this a more inclusive environment and open up the environment for other entrepreneurs and for other entities to come in to provide funding. So I don't think that we should be looking at it selfishly. We should be looking at it, how do we make it bigger? How do we make it more inclusive? And we're going to have to consistently do this. It can't just be a once-off event that we do, and we all walk away from here and think that we've done a great job.
I love it. I love those very, very key points. Lindek, how do you contribute to this conversation?
Thank you. Simone has just stolen my thunder on the second point, but I'll come through here. What I think for me is working is exactly these kind of platforms. As Simone said, we need these dialogues to take place. These conversations must happen. We must create the visibility. We can talk about all these women entrepreneurs and all these businesses. If Natalie, where she sits, she's not able to see them, how are we going to bring them up? And I think that visibility and transparency, and that means for me that we need to actually create platforms. We need to actually make sure that we are aware of what's out there. And it is not just going to happen, because I think this is where the role of our institutions should come through in terms of what we do to provide that visibility, which is, I think, what this conference is doing. We're also having another one with the Harvard and Lionesses taking place at the same time, currently. And it also speaks to women and the changing face of African entrepreneurship. And that is also another conversation that's happening. And it's looking at also how do we inform the decisions and policies and frameworks that will actually allow for this to happen. As we all know, this conversation has been taking place long before we're born, and it's still happening today. And what Simone said in terms of what should be happening and what we should not be complacent is also where we sit in terms of the decisions that are being made there. It should be something that we live daily. It should be something that we talk about, that is addressed, that is actually we do not shy away from. And funny enough, as we're sitting now, I'm getting feedback in terms of the Harvard conference that we're having. And we want to make sure we make men part of the conversations, because we're not the problem here. So we need the men to sing hallelujah. So for me, it is bring those men to this conversation. We have to work together. This is not a women problem. So we need everyone on the table. And also for me, it is what do we do to conscientize and actually educate our young women and also young girls in terms of what they do now, because the world is changing. And I think we're going to need more and more entrepreneurs. And I think for me, our programs should also focus at that pipeline as to what happens, who's coming up in the future. So for me, it is the network in terms of what's working, the visibility that this platform creates, but it is also making sure that we are aware and we bring these issues to the forefront in terms of our organizations. And it's something that we actually look at daily, and it's not something that we only leave when we have a conference.
powerful points there. He for she is definitely very important to this conversation, as they are the holders of this capital that we are trying to get more than 5% of the piece of this conversation. Natalie, what would you say is working and definitely something that all the stakeholders in the ecosystem can take under advisory?
Yeah, I mean, I think Simone and Lindiwe said it. I mean, there is these type of platforms are absolutely critical. They did not exist 5-10 years ago. I mean, certainly when I was a young woman coming through the corporate world, to have had access to something like this would have just been absolutely mind-blowing, and I think would have changed a lot of our trajectory. So I think having these platforms is fantastic, but also that women get better at networking. I mean, also I'm terrible at it. You do your job, you do your day job, you come home and you move on. And I just think men are just naturally better at business networking. We're very good at social networking, but we need to do business networking. And I think that's something that these kind of platforms have give access to women to do that. So I think that is fantastic. I mean, from what can be done better? I mean, I'd just put it out there to say, just think big. A lot of the women entrepreneurs that I meet are one-woman bands, and they've got their business and they're very happy with their business and it suits their lifestyle. And often when I encourage them, I say, well, what about growing into this or that? And you get resistance because it doesn't necessarily suit their lifestyle, and that business will stay in that space for forever, unless we as a collective think bigger, support each other, and look to grow and put businesses together that can attract the capital. So I think we all just collectively have to think big, and that would be my 1 point.
Brilliant. And as we're on the topic of business networking, this is such an excellent opportunity for us to move on over to our breakaway room for question and answers. Thank you, ladies, for capturing this conversation that really encaptured the current ecosystem and its hard-hitting agenda to lift the bed of investment bias and driving home what can be done economically to empower businesswomen across the continent and lead the impact as well as amplify it.